Welcome to today's webinar. We're focusing on pitfalls and power tips, how to run a successful data lake project. So this is a topic that we convalesced around at Podium based on our experience helping a whole bunch of customers get started on and drive the phase one implementation of an enterprise scale data lake, which we call a data marketplace. And we began to see patterns, not the obvious project management topics, but things that are really unique and special to data lakes because they are sort of a different architecture and approach. And so we thought we'd take some time to share some of those insights. Our presenter today is Peter Kim, who's one of our senior technical customer success experts. And so having said all that, I want to turn things over to Peter.
Thank you, Barb. Who I am isn't terribly important. Let's just say I come from a world where I was doing the predictive modeling, and I was helping build out large, generally customer-focused data marts and data warehouses. But most importantly for this topic, like Barbara said, is in the last couple years, I've had hands-on experience working with at least a handful of clients putting up their data lakes. And the point of today is to share some of the things that we've learned along the way. So that's really what that's about. And really, today I thought there would be just 4 general themes that I wanted to cover. And starting with the idea that, look, my history before this was somewhat repetitive around the way we approach building a data mart or a data warehouse or addressing customer data integration or building out a CRM process, right? And the methodology that we used then was pretty similar. And in the past couple of years, what we've come across is, hey, there's some really different thinking that goes along with how you maximize and accelerate deployment of data lakes. So I'll start with that. Secondly, I'm going to say, look, to get started, what are some of the foundational things you have to have set? And this will be pretty quick, actually, but just, you've got to have some of these things in place before you move forward. And then the third one, I think, is really important, possibly the most important of these, because that initial use case really sets the tone for your pace and your ability to deliver and the flavor of the environment as you go forward. So I want to talk about that. I'm going to use a current client as an example in order to illustrate that. And then lastly, going from that initial use case to what I consider this if we talk about this as a data marketplace, that grand opening, how you open the doors, let the business users in. It's going to be a little counterintuitive, I think, to say that governance is the way to do this. I'll build the case for that and talk through that. So that's what we're going to go through today. And what I want to start with is this idea around new thinking that supports the data lake. Really, I want to focus on traditional data delivery methodologies that focus on building data pipelines. So let's talk about data pipelines. And this is the way I used to do my world. In fact, my job used to be, once upon a time, a long, long time ago, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I was a business analyst. And my job was to go out to the business and say, look, what are your requirements? What do you need from this? What do you need done? And starting with that, I would go and work with the architects and whatnot and figure out, hey, where does this data come from? What specific chunks of that data do we need? And then how do we get that original data? What's the right source for this data? How do we get that data into a format that's going to fit the needs of this application? Whether it's the marketing data mart or whether it's a specific, really a very application-specific pipeline. Get that out into where we're going to do it. We load it to target. Great. And you know the story. What actually happens is, hey, no one actually knows how to give requirements, and what you present to them at the end of this process isn't quite what they wanted, or actually they hadn't they couldn't envision it. And now you give it to them, you've got to go back and modify this and change some of that, right? So, this is a traditional pipeline process. But for purposes of meeting the goal for this application, we've done our job, right? We've done a pretty darn good job of it. We've gotten what they needed and we've delivered it. So then we do this again for the next application. Maybe it's a reporting application like Tableau. They need to get and do this. And you'll see we're going to go back to the same sources. We're going to get some of the same data. We're going to do some of the same transforms, some different things, put it back out there. We do this again. You repeat over and over and over, right? And maybe it's going into Spark today, right? Because that's what people are doing. They're doing some machine learning. It doesn't matter. The same concept applies. And possibly some of this is mindset. Possibly some of this is the tool set that we choose to use. But regardless, that's what we do. And it's okay. But it's not keeping up with the speed that the business needs to deliver really data-centric applications and their data-centric needs and analytics-driven things. So the problem with this, right? So let's just start with the source systems. We're doing duplicative extracts from those source systems, right? Over and over and over again. Multiple loads, not great. We end up resizing these things just to handle this. We get smaller and smaller windows in which we can do extracts. That's the problem. We do inconsistent extracts from these systems. So if I want to go for my customer table and I'm getting first name and last name here, but here I'm getting last name and date of birth, and maybe I'm actually filtering it for this application to be everything from 2006 on, and maybe for this application, I'm taking everything from my specific line of business. Well, now I've got slightly different extracts from that, so they have to be separate extracts, right? Because I'm doing different things with it. Sometimes that extract even involves me changing that data during the extract. So now I really can't possibly replicate that. It's time consuming. Building every one of these extracts is time consuming. Considering just this, if you could eliminate 2/3 of the effort of just doing the extract, how much more manpower would you have available to build some of the analytic applications you're trying to deliver today, right? So that's not an insignificant deal here. And it's less and less important given the cost, but this is really wasteful of storage, right? We tend to move all this data, right? We have to build big pipes, we need bigger network pipes to move this stuff. We land it all over the place and we've got this data everywhere, right? So, that tends to be an issue. But what else is happening here? We're doing the same transformations over and over, or even worse, we're doing close to the same transformations, but not the same. So when I create my policy claim, element here, and I do it down here, I may do it so slightly different. And now I've got a problem because I don't have a definition for policy claim that's consistent, right? So what the folks in the reporting application, the folks in the front, the actual operating application are seeing are different. And now we have to go through a reconciliation process. That's the problem. Of course, right, every before and after architecture slide has to include the spaghetti slide before and a nice clean slide after, right? It's de facto what you have to show. But the fact is, right, this methodology and this way of approaching these solutions is very much creating these complex and difficult lineage problems, right? So like I just said around policy claim, where does it come from? How did it get there? And why do we have to reconcile these things? This leads into the next issue, which is really we are creating security and risk issues by doing that, right? So you take things like GDPR, you take things like, the Basel II requirements, right? And you need to do some of the ability to trace all these things back and reconcile them. This makes it really hard, and it makes it possible that you're going to miss things. So, we are actually creating material risk through these approaches. And then lastly, if you see what we're doing here, right, the very concept of a pipeline is we're creating this straight-through process that has a distinct endpoint. And those distinct endpoints end up serving different parties and different constituents within your environment. And that means that we are forcefully perpetuating, if not actually creating, siloed views of the business for different users. And that's a problem, right? We've been trying more and more, right? We do it with our physical space, with more open environments. We do it with flatter organizational structures. But here we are in our very information systems forcing this siloization process. And that's the problem. So these are all the things that we see as problems with the data pipeline approach. So I want us to think different about this and how we approach this. And, you know, how do we address some of these issues? Like, we have to stop repeating these extracts and duplicating this data, right? How do we do that? Well, we do a once only, bring in the data once, right? As close to raw as possible, so that all those separate pipelines now go to the same place in a reusable fashion, right? So you have that reuse and you simplify that lineage issue, right? We need to stop repeating and creating inconsistent transformations. So part of that is in the pipeline mode and pipeline methodology, the only thing we share is the end output. And really, we need to think about that transformed data, even in flight, as a shareable asset. And that's something that we need to think about as another, you know, it's a different way of thinking about how we approach these things. Of course, we need to stop these complex data flows. And as you can see, right, these kinds of approaches already help us simplify that complexity as we go through, because we're reusing raw data, right? We're reusing transformed data, and here's a real opportunity to, as you think about deploying and creating a data lake, wow, here's some real opportunities to make material impact upon the business. So, going through this, you know, Barbara challenged me with, you know, well, that's great. Well, what do people ask you when you look to this? What are some of the common questions that you run against? And so we'll get things like, well, why would I bring in all the data, right? Why do I want to do this kind of thing? Because, and again, this gets to the heart of, let's stop thinking about that pipeline, right? The point is, if I'm going to put a load on the source system to grab customer data, and whether I take 10 columns or all 20, and whether I filter it by last year or the last 2 years, right? That incremental difference isn't enormous, and it opens up the fact that we never have to do that again, right? And all the other applications don't have to keep doing this. So that is probably the number one reason. The second reason I will say for that is, as I said, we originally started with an idea of taking requirements and going back, and then once you deliver something that people don't really, when they look at it, they're like, that's not really quite what I wanted. I want it slightly different, because people need that. People need to see something in order to articulate what it is that they really want out of it. So we developed agile methodologies to sort of help with that. But the data flow has to be agile too. And this is an agile data flow, right? You land the whole thing once, and hey, when I find out that I needed first name, last name, and oh, by the way, I needed date of birth too, I've already got it. It's not something I have to go all the way back to my source to rebuild.
Yeah, and let me just add something on that, if I could, Peter, as I'm listening to you sort of share this. I would think that, in addition, at this point, as people start absorbing this different point of view about how to think about provisioning data, that storage is cheap, but it's not free. And there is a degree of complexity in bringing all of the data in. And so does the question come up about being able to create not a federated view, but use what we call the data connector to be able to deal with data in place so that you can have visibility to all of it, but decide what you want to provision through at different points.
Yeah, certainly. And actually, I'll talk about that in a bit. I think the way to think about that is if this is an environment, obviously in this example, right, customer is just one table that's sitting in this whole database. You want to have visibility to everything that's out there, right? That's a really good point. It's something that we think is the best practice is, hey, let's go and grab a catalog of everything that's out there, even though for our purpose, right, for our existing pipeline, we're only interested in this table. So that's sort of where the old pipeline thinking does make sense, where I'm just going to focus on that data I'm provisioning for my purpose. But I do want to think big and think different, and I want to grab that whole catalog so that I know, hey, here is the possible set of assets I can use going forward. Great. The other questions that we come across is, well, why should I persist all this data, right? Or much less this transform data, especially this sort of in-flight transformation. And why wouldn't I virtualize all this? I would say that we have seen over and over again this idea of virtualizing data especially for analytics purposes, right? Where we're scanning a large amount of data and doing joins on the wire. We know historically, even though the speed of the network and all these things has gotten better and better, it's painful and it's slow. There are a lot of applications that work really well with virtualization, right? If you need to do transactional level joins, that's great. It's gonna meet your needs. I think that a lot of the applications that are built around a concept of a data lake really are about these are analytic-driven applications. And that's where you want to say, look, the value of moving data once actually really pays off. So that's why I think we want to persist this data here. The other is, there are issues around security and challenges when you start talking about on-prem, off-prem, cloud, and all these things and putting it all together. So, it does make sense to put these things into one physical location to enable these things and get the performance you need. So those are some of the some of the ways I think we really ought to think different about the way we approach things. I do want to talk about getting started, right? We talk about tips and tricks to building a data lake, and going forward, I really want to talk about getting started because I actually think that's the hardest part. Because once you get that going, you end up in a virtuous cycle where it just starts taking off, and that's what we've seen. And so I put in a picture here of the Three Gorges Dam because I think the point is here that there has to be some foundational requirements in place in order to get started. And these are probably apple pie and motherhood to most of you, but it's worth repeating and saying, like, look, these things are important to have before you get started.
Yeah, I think your point was it takes a while to fill up the lake, right?
It takes a while to fill up the lake.
You don't do it overnight. It takes a while.
So I was recently just outside of Vegas at the Hoover Dam, right? Took over 2 years to fill Lake Mead, right? And this is actually a time lapse of an area near the Three Gorges Dam in China, and it took more than 5 years. And look, they set a foundation, and the dam wasn't anywhere close to being done. And they opened the sluices and start letting the water in to start filling, right? They were still building it, but they had that foundation in place to get it moving forward. So what are those foundational pieces? Absolutely, first and foremost, right, having an understanding of how you're going to implement security has to be figured out, right? I imagine most of you have this already, so this is not an issue. But there are places where we have seen that the Hadoop cluster is in its infancy, and they have not established all these things. They may have been there in other places, or they're using they've been a long time database shop, and they're using database level security. So look, let's just get the basics down, right? You all have Active Directory or LDAP. You never want to create your own set of users and groups, right? Okay, everyone can agree to that. Everyone is going to Kriberize their cluster. If you're going to get started, even if it's on a little test environment, right, it helps to have that set up already, because you know what? It's quite frankly, it's a pain in the back end. And you want to work out you want to iron out those things up front when you're doing your early development and testing, right? Because it's going to be easy to resolve this with 2 users on the thing. We believe in cluster level data authorization, right? We don't care if you're talking about Ranger or Sentry, right? We're not, it doesn't matter. They're doing more or less the same thing. There are arguments for one over the other. They're generally aligned to RU, Cloudera, or Hortonworks aligned. It doesn't matter. But the idea that there is a cluster level authorization set to data that is at the file system as well as at the query level, we think is critical to having that. And therefore, right, you've aligned your users and groups to Ranger and Sentry so that you've got a consistent view as to how to deploy authorization.
Let me ask you a question about this, Peter. In your experience working on these projects, just like what's the range of the number of people who are initially getting access just during the first stand-up and deployment, and then maybe the first use case, and how does it expand over time?
So I would say that that's interesting. So I would say that first use case, we generally see about 12 people,
yeah,
right? Because the first use case ends up being if it were simple, they would have done it some other way. So it ends up being sources from a number of disparate places, right? Some of it is hard data, like coming from a mainframe. So you've got a variety of different skill sets and knowledge bases that they bring to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it ends up being about, I would say on average, like 10 to 12 people at that first one. From there, it tends to explode. Because
which is where having it synchronized with existing Active Directory and LDAP becomes important, because the administration is just a synchronization.
Well, it's not just that. It's that the first users are the folks who are putting data into the data lake, right?
Yeah.
But then the exponential explosion comes from the fact that you start opening up access to data to a much wider range of folks than traditionally has happened. Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's one of the benefits of deploying this way in the data lake, is that you get to do that. I think the data, the data ops teams don't explode so quickly, right? Because your methodologies that you're setting up here start to become repeatable. And so it's not like you have to grow this like we used to do on a project by project basis, body shop, right? It should not grow like that, right? So it's more on the user side.
On the governance and the data consumer side.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We also see that we hear a lot of people talk about zones of data, right? Bronze, silver, gold, raw, fit for purpose, curated data. And when I hear people talk about this, they seem to have in their minds a physical model in place, right? And that's totally fine, right? You may actually want raw data to land in a certain, directory structure within a cluster and that sort of thing. But really, you should be thinking about access to these different levels of data to be aligned to your groups, right? Because this is really about permissioning. I'm going to have this curated data, and it's going to be available to a much broader set of users than I'm going to allow access to raw data, right? This is really about permissions and less about the physicality of it, right? So that's why I put this under security. So when you're thinking about that, think about how you're going to roll out these access to these zones because you want your groups to reflect that. And then I think, these models around Ranger and Sentry really are at a gross level of data authorization. But I think you also want to think about, you want users to be parts of those groups with a role that's assigned to those capabilities that they should have, right? So even though Barbara, I may authorize Barbara to have access to a certain data set around insurance claims, right? I may not want Barbara, in fact, I'm certain about this, to allow Barbara to modify the ingestion process around that, but I do want her to be able to query it, right? So you do want to think about a role-based access. But again, this is probably all established already in your shops, but if not, right, start here and start having these discussions. So here's an interesting thought that we keep running up against, and something that you should think differently around is, so the Hive database. We find that there's a lot of traditional thinking, database, Oracle type of thinking around defining restrictions around Hive. And one of the things around the data lake is you do want to empower users to bring their own data, right? There's a lot of value in that. They may not have to be set up to do, wiped out incremental loads on their data, but a lot of your organization has its own data. And wouldn't you rather have visibility to it and have a catalog and a chance for it to be governed than sitting in an Access database on that PC with the sticky on it under a desk that says "Do not turn off"? Right. This is no way to run your business. As part of that, right, you want to let people land that data and create their own Hive databases within there. Because, right, if you do this right, we're just setting up metadata. It's just pointing at files. It's not like what it used to be in terms of what we used to have in the damage I could have done on Oracle or Teradata or anything like that. So think about that as you start approaching this. So, and again, I'll start with a thought here, right? The perfect is the enemy of the good. But given that, I will say this: if you love your SharePoint or you love your network file share, this is not going to resonate with you because I hate both of those. It's a nightmare. You can't find anything. And as much as it was enabling because I now was able to put anything I want up there, the problem was I was able to put anything I want up there any way I wanted. So here I want to talk about, these are some basics that you can put into place that will prevent that from happening. And let's start with really basic taxonomy. Your first level of that's going to be your deployment environments, right? Your dev, test, and prod, that's probably going to be set up fairly straightforward. Beneath that, right, at a file level, think about how you want to segregate production from sandbox. So you've got that data coming from record-keeping systems that's going to be coming in lights out over and over, but you've also got, hey, marketing just bought this demographics file and they don't even know if they're going to renew it, but they want to bring it in and put it in there. How you enable that sandbox and that production to coexist in the same cluster, but not muddy the waters neither, right? Once you're into that concept of production, and of course you do need to give users a way to move from sandbox to production for those items they learn have real value. Once you're in that production environment, you got to think about, well, what's that taxonomy I want to have for where do I temporarily land this data? Where do I want this data to persist? Is there an archiving strategy? Where does that go? And when I'm moving data out, where do I provide space for that temporary shipping? And just that very simple taxonomy structure and setting that up as a standard makes sure that you can find and understand the data that's out on your cluster today, right? So let's start with that. And again, what used to happen is each application would set up their own taxonomy, and then we couldn't reconcile this. Likewise, an H catalog or Hive, Impala, whatever you want to call it, right? How you want to define things as databases and entities. Again, I say loosen it. It's not a big deal. It's okay to have hundreds of databases. It's just metadata. But having standards around that is going to make this a much easier, because let's face it, if we're talking about a data lake and we're talking about an enterprise data lake, we could be talking about tens of thousands of entities. So that's why starting with this in place up front is going to mean the difference between you having SharePoint or you having something that's usable.
I think it's surprising too, obviously not in the initial deployment of these projects, but already we find more and more the conversations get to multi-lake, the next circle out of this complexity pretty early on, right? Synchronization.
Right. Yep, that's a good point. It's a really good point. Canonical format. This seems really nerdy and boring, but we find that our clients, our most successful clients, are ones that have done things and said, look, we're going to standardize on Parquet, for example, and have reasons for that. Really, it's not that big a deal, in my opinion, right? Pick a format that you know is going to be supported by the tools that you're using to read, and that is going to have legs and continue to be supported in the future, right? When it comes to, establish lineage from this start, right? When you bring data in, make sure you capture that lineage, because in 2 months from now, when someone comes back to figure out where this came from, it's not going to be patently obvious, right? So do that. Also, right, as you bring in data, drop it into the catalog, right, into your catalog. Make sure that as you're bringing it in, you're building that catalog of this on the way, because doing a catalog after the fact, and there's some cool tools that do that, right? But building it after the fact is just, the tail wagging the dog. If you know what you're bringing in, that's the point at which you have the most knowledge about what this data is. Validate everything. So there's this concept of drop everything into the lake and we'll figure it out later. We think for this to be really useful, even for your initial pipeline, right, that you're thinking about building here, you want to think about, hey, I need this data to meet a certain level of quality for it to be useful. You can figure out what that means in your organization. I want to call this validation and not data quality, right? So because again, we are trying to say, look, here is a raw zone of data that is as close to the source as we can get. And if the source has the data wrong, you don't want to fix that at this point. You want to keep that raw data. Why? Because your correction may be wrong, right? You want to have that history and keep it there. So validation is a looser definition than data quality. And profile everything, right? Here's a real opportunity to have a single place where you can come in, look at the data, understand, hey, is this data, how populated is this column, right? What do I know about it? What kind of values do I typically see here? I think that these are critical things to build as part of that, right? That goes into your catalog, and people can start to understand what that's all about. So there's a couple opportunities here around think different, right? Don't align your taxonomy to applications. We've seen this again and again, and having a taxonomy that goes down from app level down is really built around not sharing, and it's built around delivering to a specific requirement as opposed to putting data into a data lake, right? Don't have an app aligned taxonomy. I would also say that this schema on read is an interesting concept. The idea of schema on read was sort of like it's the same way I feel about JSON, right? It's good for the person putting it there. It's not good for anyone who has to consume it, right? Because there's no structure. And that, let's be real, right? The majority of the data in our enterprises are structured, or at least semi-structured. So why would you not capture that at the time that you're bringing this in? All right. So again, now we're getting started. What does that initial use case look like that's going to make us successful? I'm going to walk through a client, a fairly recent client that is gone from a purchase on March 1st to at the end of March, they were delivering actual value to the business. And how this looks like a really great model for moving forward, right? And I can see this because not only have they delivered business value and proven this, right? We also see the pile-on effect about how fast this is going to scale. So, you know, how did they do this? How did they get this happen so fast? And look, I actually want to point out it was actually 15 days of work that they did because we started training in the middle of the month. So how did they start this? Well, this project, they started to build this lake around this project. And in 15 days, really, we'll give it the month, they delivered business value. There is no way they had a conversation that came to consensus around an enterprise standard, much less gotten that through procurement in that time, right? So they were able to align this value. So again, this is how cheap that data lake can be, right? It can prove itself to be of value based on a single use case. So that was really important in here, and it got them up and going. This was a use case that was really, as Barbara put in the quotes here, hair on fire requirements. For those of us with less hair, it's not that frightening. So really, their existing processes weren't going to keep up with this backlog, and they were just going to drown. So here was an opportunity to take try a different approach that was going to help them deliver on this, and that really got them up and running. They had folks who were not Hadoop experts. They were not Java programmers. They were folks who knew and understand how to deliver data, right? Data prep teams, ETL folks, and they knew how to solve that problem. Now, there was challenges with that, right? There are folks who are thinking pipeline, right? These are folks who are thinking ETL. They're thinking about there's a bunch of things around ETL that, you know, just don't really apply anymore. And okay, that's okay, right? It's a process, and these folks got over it fairly quickly. But you know, initially it was a barrier for them going forward initially.
Peter, I think you said that so for this particular customer, and by the way, we have the opposite story as well. We have customers who launched a data lake project and had a pretty big vision about moving from what I would call an existing architecture of ETL and data warehouses to a next generation architecture around standing up a pretty large Hadoop cluster and pre-positioning a whole lot of data. And where they had such a big vision, and that vision touched so much of the existing infrastructure and so many teams and tools that it took months and months and months really to get started. And it was only in those cases because of the vision and determination of the leadership on the project that it kept going. But certainly what this client did is a much easier way to go because it adds zero complexity initially, which is a killer, right, to the environment. Slots right in, very targeted at a narrow data provisioning project, and delivered ROI in a matter of weeks. And I think one of the things you said about this, Peter, was the reason it got less resistance, the change got less resistance, is because, number one, the people using the tool were the same people who had the hair on fire problem, who owned responsibility for delivering data and were not keeping up with SLAs or the backlog. And because of that, they already had all the data expertise, too. They knew where the data lived. They had access privileges. They understood what data preparation and ETL was.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
And then, the last couple, the 4 and 5, really, they're leveraging stuff that's already there, right? There was already a test cluster that they could use to start doing the dev work while they set up a production environment. They had their security framework was well defined. And, the last point is they are embracing this change from a data pipe to a data ops kind of thinking, right?
Yeah.
So, what was the same and what was different? They started with this pipeline that they needed to build, right? They have an end requirement that they needed to do. But what they did was they expanded this extract concept, right, to get whole tables from the source. Some of these were Salesforce.com, some were sitting in Teradata and whatnot, and what they would have done previously is filtered and grabbed selected records. But in this case, what they did is they got the whole thing, right, as part of it and put that into it. While they were there, they cataloged the entire source. And Barb brought up this concept earlier, the idea being that, look, if I'm just going to connect to Oracle and query the DDL and get information about this table, I'm going to do the entire thing. And now I've got that in my catalog as a data asset that exists out there. It may not be in the lake. It's appropriately identified as not yet in the lake, but an asset that is available and already tagged and defined in how you get to it. So you are now making this, you're perpetuating that concept of, hey, here's the one-stop shop to get what you need.
I have a question actually has come in, Peter. The question has to do with basically, are you saying that they basically threw out their ETL tools, or how did they reconcile this with the ETL that they already had in place?
Oh, that's interesting. So no, they did not throw away their ETL tools. They saw that the creation and management of the data lake itself was a separate thing, and that the ETL tools now are using that validated catalog data in the data lake and going from there. And they're using a broader set of ETL tools actually on top of that.
Okay, and there's another question too. My governance guys would want IBM IGC to work with this. How would that work?
Oh, that's interesting. So, we find that, so we have clients, by the way, who are working with a number of different governance tools, whether it's IGC or Calibra. And, there's a couple challenges that those tools have that we don't, right? Those tools, they need to go get a catalog, right? We're going to get that catalog automatically because we're managing the data. So in many cases, the best collaboration between those tools is for us to feed that back to those types of tools like IGC, and we've done that, right? We can push that out there. IGC or Calibra or whatever you're going to use in the meantime can feed back things that they have, like, look, this is the approved definition. This is the data topic in which this lives, and other things like that, as well as maybe some additional tags and other things like that. So it's not, I would say, it's integrated, and there are things that happen out in those governance tools that don't happen here, and vice versa. There are things that happen here, and together, actually, it makes a really, really strong story.
Yeah, and let me just throw a little tiny pitch in there. I know the question was about IGC, but our partner Information Asset has actually just finished building a two-way handshake between Podium and Calibra. So we could, for example, ingest a source, do all the validation profiling, build all of the comprehensive metadata describing the content of that source, synchronize that with the Calibra catalog. They could add stuff in there too, business rules and business metadata, et cetera, and then pass it back to us. So if there's anybody who's interested in knowing more about that, just shoot me a little chat and I will hook you up with the right people.
And so just this last bullet point here, right? What they saw is when they cataloged all this data, right? They saw that other applications, other parts of that same application team, even within that same ultimate end goal, were reusing some of the data that they already brought in. Right, so that reusability is real and comes up really quickly. So that think different, right? Expand your reach if you're touching that source catalog at all, right? We've already said that. I haven't said this yet, but here's an opportunity to start thinking about metrics. This is your first use case. It doesn't matter, right? Think about some metrics that you can actually collect. How long did it take us to set up the first extract, and then the second one, and then the third one? Things that you can track, and you'll know over time whether these are the right metrics. But here's a chance to set a baseline. Don't overthink this, right? But start to collect some of those metrics where we've got folks who are happy to help you define some of those. But how long did it take to get the time to answer, right? And those sorts of things. So how do we get to this idea of a data marketplace, right? A data bazaar, a place where your end users can come in and actually get data from the data lake, which I think ultimately is where we get to some real value around the data lake. And I'm going to offer that the way to get there is via governance. And I know a lot of you may have sort of a vision of governance as a bureaucrat whose job is to say no, right? But I think you'll find they're much more collaborative given what you're bringing into the offering here, and they're going to be excited to work with you. And you know what? You're going to actually have a chance to actually define how this is going to move forward. So look, let's talk about what we've done. You've already got the data. You've cataloged it, right? You've set up authorization, right? Half of governance, I think, starts with authorization. You've got lineage. You've got quality metrics on this. You've got a statistical profile. Oh, again, which goes back to IGC. Maybe these are all things that you can push back into IGC, which helps those folks in governance, right? Because they don't have to run information analyzer to do all these things. You've already done it for them. So the question then becomes, well, we've done all of it, right? Isn't that governance's job? And the answer is not quite, right? Because they're going to bring things like, hey, what's the actual business term? What's the category? How is this tagged? Who has ownership of this? How do we manage the retention policy? Is this a source of truth for a certain kind of data, right? And helping to find that. Now, you put those together, and what you get is a generalized data catalog and data access that's suitable for widespread consumption, or a data marketplace, right? So with with having business definitions as well as statistical profiles and knowledge that I can only get to what I'm supposed to have, and it's got lineage, right? You can now open up the doors to your data marketplace.
Can I interrupt you right there? Because there was a couple questions that actually came in that I think are relevant here. One was, what was our experience in terms of does the creation of the lake create a stress in terms of whether those data consumers, do you have to take up the skill level in the consumer community on data access and data analytics skills typically?
So in our opinion, the way we do things here at Podium, the answer is no, right? Because we believe that you only put things into the data marketplace that are ready to be queried by those users. So that means you don't put things that have arrays and objects in it. That means you've converted those things into queryable tables, right? That means that we've already talked about, right? You've set up the appropriate authorization. You've made those definitions available. So it shouldn't change, the skill levels of the folks that need it.
Maybe you want to, if I could be really bossy here, say something too about we're always working alongside a Tableau or a Click or sometimes even wrangling tools that take it that last mile for the user.
Right. So we think the data marketplace as, hey, this is where you come and find that data. This is a catalog. This is where it determines all that. There should be a fairly simple step over to your BI tools, right? Because all of this should be exposed in a way that your BI tools have ready access to it, and you should be able to do that analysis that they need.
Sorry to derail you again, but one more question that came up had to do with, in our experience, is there a critical mass of data that you have to have before you expose this? Like, a certain minimum set to make it a positive experience?
So the minimum set is the minimum set that those consumers are going to need. Right?
Yeah.
So it does get rolled out in a fashion that is that does sort of fit what the consumers need. Now, that's never going to be enough, quite frankly, but that's good because those consumers now see that there's data in the data marketplace. They're actually going to now align their needs and their asks for, hey, I could also use X in my marketplace, and that's going to help you define your projects going forward.
Okay.
Which actually is a good point. I'm going to skip this because we're running short on time. You know, this was sort of your first steps into a program of delivering on a data marketplace, right? There's a whole methodology that your program office is going to love, which of course aligns to business business drivers and delivering value along that and going through a process that starts with what we've talked about, but sort of does that in an iterative way and starts adding some more structure around that. And exactly what you've been talking about, Barb, bringing those consumers in and layering them in. They're going to start bringing in those things to help you define and establish what are those use cases, being able to put value on them and start to prioritize them as you go forward, right? And just so you guys know, right, there is a lot of work around a complete methodology to do all this, right, that this is all excerpted from, including like, you know, how do you get these benefits over a data warehouse, right? What's the process for moving, for metadata movement, right? What do you do in your first phase versus your second phase, et cetera, et cetera? If we were a consulting firm, we'd be, we could sell a bazillion of this, but that's not what we want to do, right? We're Podium Data, right? We build the tools that help you do these things.
Sure. And I think we're almost out of time, but there's one more question that came in, Peter, which was, is there typically a bill back from the business to IT on these projects where once they provision data and there's like a consumption metered based model for the data lake in the business and the cost to stand up the new environment?
It's probably a little outside of my pay grade. I will tell you the one time I have seen them try to set up a true data marketplace where, right, there's a cost for consuming data and the owners of the data actually get paid back. Where they tried to do this, which I think is a great idea, politically it was untenable, right?
Yeah.
They couldn't figure out how to actually set up a pricing model that worked in that case, right? So is it a volume? Well, the value isn't necessarily based on volume, right? So how do you determine value and make that appropriate?
And I'll add one thing to that, which is we have occasional meetings of our customers, our executive advisory committee, and at the last meeting there was a lot of discussion on this point. And someone asked the question about this, and the answer went another direction, which is a more important thing for a lot of these IT leaders running these projects is being able to set up time-limited sandboxes. So if a data group comes with an interest in a data set for a potential project, they'll basically provision all the data through the data lake pretty quickly, set up a sandbox and provide access to a group of analysts to go in there and study the viability of that data for their particular need, and then they'll shut it down. And so instead of thinking about billing back from the business, what they're really trying to do is find places where they can get traction and adoption. It is quite viral, meaning when word gets out that there's this more agile way to get the data you need for various analytic projects, it doesn't take long before new people and new data and new analytic load shows up. So we're just about at the top of the hour here. So I just want to reiterate a couple key things. First of all, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and thank Peter for taking time to share some of the patterns and insights that we've gleaned from working with customers on these projects.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. This webinar is being recorded. We will send around a link to the recording tomorrow in an email. I'll include Peter's contact details in there if you want to follow up with him. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me or to Peter, and we'll be happy to help you out. So thank you again. And with that, I am going to end today's webinar.